This happened years ago when I was 19, and I'm now in my mid-20s. I still remember this very clearly because of just how creeped out I was. Back then, I was living 600 plus miles away from my parents in a different state. Even though there was a distance, my mum and I still talked on the phone at least twice a week, and we were still really close. So, when we found out that her cancer was back, I didn't think twice about dropping everything to drive down to see her. A plane ticket would be too expensive, and I had a 10-year-old Toyota that might have been a bit beat up, but still got me from A to B cheaply and quietly. My parents weren't thrilled at the idea of me driving the 11 hours by myself, but my mind was made up. So they offered me a deal, and I would stop at a rest stop every 2 hours and stretch my legs and call them, and in exchange for this courtesy, they would pay for my gas. And if I didn't call within the 3-hour window, though, they would assume that I'd been in an accident and call me repeatedly, interrupting the audiobook or podcast that they knew that I would have on. And so I accepted the deal. And that's why I was at this particular rest stop at 2:45 a.m. Now, this was actually one of those nicer stops. Well lit, multiple vending machines that didn't have those huge cages around them. The payphone wasn't broken, and it looked really clean. There were a couple of cars there with people just sleeping in them, and I still had 15 minutes before I had to check in with my parents. I got out of my car and stretched, and that almost jumped out of my skin when I heard a man's voice right behind me. He said, "Miss, can I ask you a favor?" I turned around, and he's leaning against my car. I have no idea how he got there so fast. I mean, I didn't see him when I parked, but there he was, uncomfortably close to me. He looked like he was in his 40s, I'd guess. He didn't look dirty or twitchy, and he was too close, but his body language didn't scream threatening or anything, and even though I was 19 years old, barely over 5 feet, and at that point in my life 110 pounds soaking wet, and even though I had already binged a lot of true crime media and knew the dangers of a girl my age alone at night with an out-of-state license plate, my dumbass asked what he needs. He told me that he accidentally locked his keys and his phone in his truck, and if he could just borrow my phone real quick to call his friend. It would just take a second, and it would really help him out. And I almost handed him my phone. I was reaching into my pocket to hand it to him with a no problem, and then I actually looked at his face. Like I said, this rest stop was surprisingly well lit, and this guy looked really normal. Except for his eyes. He had these dead shark eyes. You know what I'm talking about, right? It's the kind of Ted Bundy or Dick Cheney, actress in a Glade commercial who was trying to convince us that she's in love with a dumbass who doesn't know how air freshener works eyes. They're smiling, but the eyes are vacant and creepy and just staring way too hard. I got that feeling, that runaway feeling, and I knew immediately not to hand this guy my only way to call for help. And so I put on my best customer service smile and told him, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, but I don't have a charger, and I need to save all my battery for the tracking app my parents have on my phone. And I need that juice to call my parents, which I actually have to do right now, but good luck." And I turned and walked about 20 feet away, and he doesn't leave. He was still just leaning up against my car, just watching me. And at this point, I really didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave him alone with my car because he creeped me out and he had that kind of serial killer face. So going to the bathroom was out too, but I also wanted to get away from him, prove that I'm not going to help him and maybe he'll leave, and I could technically get into the car, but I would have to get really close to him unless I crawled over my passenger side seat, and he was definitely not moving. So I did the first thing that popped to mind. I called my dad. And my dad, for the first time that night, he actually didn't pick up the phone. When I heard his voicemail, I glanced back, and the guy still hadn't moved. He's still just staring at me. So I faked a phone conversation with my dad, and I angled my body so that the guy couldn't see that I had hung up the phone, and loudly said that I should be home in about 30 minutes, when in reality, I was still at least 4 hours away. I mentioned exactly where I was and reassured the fake caller that this was a good rest stop with plenty of lighting and a couple of visibility security cameras. But the guy He still hadn't moved, and I'm running out of steam on this fake conversation at this point. In the years since, I've thought of a lot of things that I could have said while pretending to talk to my dad, but in that moment, I was beginning to seriously freak out and my mind just went blank. So I hung up and I didn't know what to do. I had hoped the fake phone call would scare him off, but he was still leaning up against my car. I stalled for another couple of minutes and I bought some cookies from the vending machine. I walked around a little, stretching, and at this point, he's been leaning up against my car for at least 10 minutes. I honestly debated waking up one of the men sleeping in their parked cars and asking for help, and just the thought of having to wake someone up to help me into my own fucking car annoyed me enough that I stopped stalling and I just headed back to my car. I decided that unless he touched me, I'm just going to pretend that he isn't there. He waited until I was unlocking my car door before he started talking to me again, and he told me again that he really needs to use my phone. He's stranded here unless he can call his friend to bring the spare keys. He's not angry or begging, mind you, and his voice sounds weirdly friendly, but he'd been creepily watching me for just way too long while blocking my exit, so I wasn't falling for it. I almost pointed out the working payphone just in case I was wrong about this, and I was being a bitch to a guy who actually needs help, but then he leaned forward as I was getting in, and I lost all nerve and slammed and locked the door as fast as possible. He didn't move until I started the car and put it in reverse, and then he finally stepped back and let me pull out. I didn't even have my seatbelt on, I was just so focused on getting away from him. And then, halfway out of the rest stop, my mum finally called me. My mum, who would freak out if I don't pick up, and who was actually really sick, and I needed to put on my seatbelt, and I could still see him in the mirror, and he was standing right next to where I was parked with his back to me. He was far enough away that I felt okay parking again to answer the phone, but I kept my engine running and I just kept watching him. I obviously don't want to worry my mum, so I told her everything was fine, where I am and my ETA and all that. And now that I was in my locked car away from him, I was beginning to feel like maybe I had overreacted. She scolds me about speeding or something, and I tune her out because the guy is moving now. And as my mum is lecturing me about road safety, I watch the guy cross to a truck, unlock the door, and get in. The keys being locked in this truck no longer seemed to be an issue for him, and I watched the truck head back out to the freeway and drive out of sight. I had to pretend to be fine to not upset my mum, and I didn't get back onto the road for another 20 minutes, and when I did, I didn't speed because I didn't want to see that truck. I found out years later that the closest city to that rest stop has a major problem with sex trafficking, and girls who look like they don't live nearby or maybe look like they're living out of their cars, they tend to be targets. I don't know if that was what was happening or if he was just trying to scare me into handing over my phone or something, but either way, it was a bit of a scary night. So yesterday, I was hiking at the Barton Creek Greenbelt like I do almost every week, and I decided to go off trail, which I had done many times before. Except this time, I went much deeper into the woods than I have had before. I was following the river when I stumbled upon a cave, and it was kind of small, and I would have had to have crawled on my belly to get in, and so I was alone and I decided to pass on that for the time being. Not long after, though, I found two more caves next to each other. These were much bigger, and I could see some sort of support beams not far inside. I approached the larger of the two and began to enter when suddenly I saw a pair of red eyes blink from the darkness. This threw me off, obviously, as I wasn't expecting to find anything in there, and I decided to just leave whatever was in there alone. But on my way back, I passed the cave again, and curiosity took hold of me, and I decided to enter once more to take a brief look. This time, I didn't see any eyes, so I figured the thing that was there before must have left. I went in a bit further, where I heard shuffling deeper in the cave. I froze, trying to listen, and the shuffling seemed to be going away from me, and I started to back out when I heard just a blood-curdling scream. It came from the darkness, and I just bolted, not knowing what it was or what it would do to me, and upon researching later, I found that the scream that I had heard was actually similar to that of a supposed skinwalker scream that I found on YouTube. But could this be real or a prank? I don't know, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll update you guys with pictures and a video when I go back with some friends. I was 10 years old when we moved to a new apartment. It was in a bad neighbourhood, but my mum, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, had no choice in the matter. You see, we had just been released from a domestic violence shelter, and turning down a cheap house just wasn't an option, no matter if it was in the ghetto or not. And our first and last day of living there follows. So, after we were dropped off, we claimed our bedrooms, even though we had nothing but a few garbage bags of clothes. Not a single piece of furniture or even a bed was in there, and I claimed the upstairs because it was a cool idea to have 2 floors. I also imagined running down the stairs to catch the school bus, and my 8-year-old brother chose the room next to mine. My 5-year-old sister was sharing a room with our mum downstairs, and it was right beside the front door. After our excitement wore down, we had to walk to the grocery store since we didn't have any food either, and while I was reading the magazines, I casually saw a cell phone that had been left on the racks. At the time, 2001, a few people had them, and definitely not people like us. So I picked it up, and I found my mum, and I showed her with my face shocked. She immediately put it in her purse, and I kind of became angry at her because I knew that this wasn't the right thing to do. We should tell the manager of the store or wait by the magazines and see if someone comes back to find it. But nope. Mum told me to be hush and just continued to shop. She wasn't a thief or anything. I never saw her steal anything before then, and I was still a little mad at her when we arrived back at our new home, but we all obviously started taking turns with the phone playing the classic game Snake. When it came time to sleep, we literally piled all of our clothes in my mum's floor. It was the only thing that we could use for a bed, and us kids were goofing around on our pallet, and Mum was in the living room, and that's when we heard banging on the door. Someone was screaming to let them in the house, a male voice, an unknown voice, banging and kicking the door, and he screamed, "Let me in or I'll kill you." Mum grabbed the phone and immediately called 911, and after she told them the address and the information, she urgently said before hanging up, "Hurry or we're about to die." She ran us to the bedroom and told us to hide in the closet, and she slammed the door behind her. Of course, me being 10, I immediately opened it back up to peep through to see what was about to happen. I didn't see my mum anywhere, and the kicking and the banging just kept getting faster and louder, and he was shouting, "I know someone's in there, open up this door." Mum came out of the bathroom, holding the toilet tank lid over her head, and she stood by the entrance of the door waiting for him to eventually break in. Her face was frozen in the most serious expression, and she was focused, holding this object almost like a tennis racket. She honestly didn't move at all, and she was ready to do something that she probably never imagined she'd do. Attack a complete stranger and maybe even kill him. She never said a word back to him or to us, and I saw their lights before I heard them. The man was still cursing while the police subdued him, and he sounded different though. Disappointed, defeated. The cops then opened up our door, and I think that he had just finished breaking it enough to come inside. My mum was still holding the tank lid in her warrior tennis stance, and the cop calmly took it away from my mum and said, "It's okay, we got him." Within 2 seconds, she bursted into tears and fell to her knees crying and thanking them, and after we all hugged and calmed down a little bit, a cop who offered to stay and patrol until sunrise told my mum something in confidence. She actually shared with me years later that the stranger was a registered sex offender with previous burglary charges as well. The next morning, we got picked up by a family friend, and we ended up staying with her until we found a safer place to live. And that was right before my mum gave birth to my brother. I don't know why he picked our apartment or why he tried so hard to get in, but I'm really glad that my mum ended up stealing that phone. It was turned off the next day, but we still used it occasionally to play Snake. My ex-wife and I purchased a home in Missouri in 2000. We had 3 children at the time, and the house, in our words at the time, seemed to be asking for us to buy it. It seemed so full of light and just inviting, and I was a total skeptic at the time, but it didn't take long for us to notice things happening. It all started with candles just going out that we lit. That happens from time to time, so we didn't pay a lot of attention to it except for when they appeared to just blow out right in front of us. But then the banging started. Every night at 10:15 p.m, we heard what sounded like a chest of drawers falling over in one of the bedrooms upstairs. And this went on for months. Then, in the master bedroom upstairs, we would occasionally hear what sounded like several kids running and playing, except all of the kids were either in school or downstairs at the time. I would go up and check, and every time I went up, there was nothing there. But then, we would both wake up at night, and we started seeing a dark figure standing beside the bed. But one night, my ex-wife ran downstairs where I was, terrified because the dark figure was on top of her in the bed. I would smell perfume in the house that just wasn't any of hers, and I would smell it when I was there alone, and many, many times I felt such an oppression or terror that I would have to leave the house and didn't find any relief until I was outside. We actually had 3 babies while we lived there too, and 3 of them have played with something while they were in their cribs alone. When they were able to talk, they called the playmate Stephen, but that was the name of their older brother, and he was asleep upstairs at the time. One of our daughters would actually wake up screaming every night too, and I set up a video camera in the room on her crib, and the first night, it happened. I was happy that I caught it on camera, but reviewing the footage at the time the screaming happened, the camera was knocked over and turned off right before the incident. But many, many times I would close and lock the front door, which had an old deadlock, and by the time I left the foyer, the door would click and open on its own. But the basement smelt like cat piss the entire time we lived there, and after the first 6 months or so, I went so far as scrubbing the entire basement, more like a cellar, with bleach, but it always smelled like ammonia or cat piss down there. But we had neighbors that told us that they thought the house was haunted, and they would see someone in the master bedroom window at the front of the house that wasn't one of us, and I've heard my name called behind me when no one else was in the house. But the most shocking series of incidents was this. So my son, who was about 5 at the time, had the bedroom upstairs. I put him into bed and he was afraid, saying that there were these mean guys in the walls that kept waking him up at night. I told him that I'll be mad at them and to come and tell me if that happened, and, well, he did tell me several times, but I couldn't find anything going on. One night I put him to bed and closed the closet door that was open and stopped at his door to tell him goodnight again, and he said he's not in there anymore and pointed to the closet door. And it was open. I closed it again and told him that it was okay, and about an hour later he came back down and told me that Joshua was in his room again and that he brought the mean guys. I walked him back upstairs and put him to bed and assured him that he would be okay, and about 15 minutes later I heard my son crying, so I started upstairs to check on him and found him lying on the stair landing. I asked him what was wrong, and he said, crying and shaking, "It's okay, they can have my room." And he slept with me that night. We moved from that house around 2007 or so, I think, and I had to go back a few times alone during the moving process, and I felt like I was an intruder and someone was pissed that I was there. I never stayed any longer than I had to, and I always left very quickly, and I'm really glad to not be living there anymore, but I've often wanted to contact the new owners and ask them if they'd had any experiences like we did. But there are many more experiences, mind you, that I could talk about, but I'll end with this one. While we were moving out, my wife had an antique vanity that I bought for her, and as we loaded it up, we noticed at the bottom of one of the legs the words "Help Me" was scratched or deeply gouged into it. And I can guarantee that was not there when I bought it, because I touched up the scratches when I brought it home. Okay, so first of all, I don't want this to seem like a story in search of sympathy or anything, but more of a way to finally accept it and move on, and hopefully help other people realize the red flags in a relationship that I so blindly overlooked. I'm sorry this is a little long too, but please bear with me as it's worth the listen. So, some background information to begin with. I'm 18 years old and I met this boy Trent. Trent and I met through a mutual friendship group of friends that I was very close with for many years. We started hanging out as a group to smoke and sesh with our friends, and he was honestly the loveliest boy with such kind eyes and the most adorable smile, and I was infatuated. Trent had a past before I knew him, troubles with past girlfriends, and a bit known for a bad temper, but I ignored the warnings from multiple people, and even an ex of his, assuming the classic lie that he'll never hurt me though. We started dating late March last year, the 21st to be exact, and he asked me out on a night when he had taken a lot of Xanax for fun with his friends and was expressing to me and his friends within 2 months of knowing him how he was completely head over heels for me, and that just made me fall deeper and deeper. Everything was just so exciting and new, and he honestly gave me butterflies. Side note to this too is that I had been diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder and bipolar 2 disorder, which just adds to the fun of my life, right? Anyway, all was good until about 4 months of being together, and I was home one night, planning to push through it and go out for some drinks with him and some friends, but changed my mind as I just physically could not leave my bed. That night he disappeared, his phone off for hours, and honestly, me worried sick. In the morning, I wake up to a message saying that his phone had gotten broken when he got pushed into the pool and he had to leave it to sit and write overnight. He came over to my house that day and took care of me while I was sick. 2 months go by and I find out 3 days before my birthday that on that exact night he had cheated on me after he enticed his ex-girlfriend to go over to his house, saying that he was going to take his own life because we had a fight and I wouldn't speak to him anymore. They did it, obviously, and when I found out, it just broke me. My heart ached and raced and pounded in my chest, and I left his house in tears with him chasing me up the street after me, and I hid in a driveway and turned off my tracking location that he set up on my phone and caught the first bus that I saw after hiding and watching him pace around the streets, shirtless and shoeless while searching for me. An hour later, I decided to answer his call number 23 or so, and just tell him to leave me alone, and it was then that he screamed and cried and begged, but I didn't give in, and so I just ended the call. 2 minutes later, he called me saying that he needed to go to hospital as he shattered his hand while punching a hole in a glass mirror behind his door. After a few weeks of my heart longing for him and him begging for me, I felt like he must have just really loved me to do all this, and it was the stupidest mistake I ever made, but we got back together. His behavior continued throughout a 6-month relationship too, and if I didn't answer a phone call, I'd receive 10 within 5 minutes, messages of how I was a dog and a bitch and just terrible stuff like that. This occurred too, even if I just left my phone in my room for 20 minutes while I had dinner or something. He demanded to see me all the time and begged to be by my side every minute. I saw all of this as an expression of his love to me. I know, it makes me sick too. Our relationship was spent majorly just smoking daily, and I mean all day. And if I wasn't stoned, all hell would break loose until he could get high again. I spent hundreds of dollars just buying all sorts of stuff to help him feel better when we'd argue in the car or he'd be in a bad mood. He had made threats to me too and my friends in the past about killing all of our dogs, and my friends didn't see it the way that I did, and eventually we had our falling outs, and he assured me that they weren't my real friends anyway. He was the only person that I had in my life who truly cared and loved me, and I stupidly believed that. Obviously, my confidence diminished, my happiness was released in the smallest doses, and I began to stop recognizing the girl who I was and couldn't remember how it felt to really feel genuine happiness. Only when he was in a good mood and wanted to be intimate and cuddly, and that's the only time I ever felt good. On our 6-month anniversary, we had a lovely dinner in the city and at a super expensive restaurant, and after our meal and a few drinks, he told me to go wait around the corner for him to pay while I called a cab. I found out when we walked out that he hadn't paid and we just made a run for it. Later that night, we went to visit our 2 best friends who were also a couple and were our smoking squad, as we like to call ourselves, and we decided to go for a little drive. My sober friend was driving, just around the corner, and smoke a little before going to bed. It was while we were chopping up that me and my friend Bella were whispering in the back. Trent couldn't quite understand what we were talking about and demanded to know what we were saying, and as a joke, Bella sarcastically replied that I was talking about another boy. And this is when he ran around to her side of the car, and as he did this, I pulled the lock on her door and he punched a hole straight through a window, leaving shatters of glass just flying all over him. The police came for a noise complaint, and after coming up with an excuse, I was left to walk my boyfriend home while he was sobbing and apologizing. And eventually, we were escorted home in the police car. We broke up that weekend after encounters of him smashing his head into a wall, swiping a photo frame off the table and slicing his hand, punching a hole in my brother's car window screen, and grabbed my shirt while I was driving, and I had officially been scared enough and saw for the first time that he might actually be really dangerous. I told him that I just couldn't be with him after the damage to my brother's car, and my family would never look at him the same and would ban me from seeing him. The very next morning, he made me pick him up though at 8 a.m. and he took the car to get the window fixed so I wouldn't leave him. In short words, I didn't forgive him. A week later, a week of hundreds of missed calls, thousands of messages off every single social media possible, he began sending me photos of bottles of Xanax that he was buying, telling me that he was going to eat them all and that it was going to be all my fault. My heart honestly sank, and I answered his call and begged him not to be so silly. I told him that I would go to see him that afternoon to make sure he was okay, but not get back together. He honestly seemed happy about that and hung up on the phone. That day, I was with a couple of girlfriends at a pool party with some of my old friends that he didn't particularly like, and after being there for maybe an hour or so, I bet you can guess who just lets themselves in and walks straight inside, demanding to everyone that I leave right now. I obviously refused because I was petrified, and his eyes, I knew that look, the way his green eyes just turned almost black when he was in rage. I continued to refuse and told him that I would come outside and talk to him if he let me bring one of the boys outside to make sure I was okay. And he did not take to that one bit and decided to just leave. Okay, so that was kind of a relief for me, right? Well, less than 20 seconds later, we hear smashing in the side street, and the whole house ran out to investigate and watched as just Trent ran back to his car and sped off after ripping off the windscreen wipers of another one of my best friend's cars and shattering each window. At this point, we were all just worried and angry and confused, so we decided that we should just drop the damaged car to my house so it was off the streets at least and somewhere safe. However, my car was parked a few streets over, and I got into the car and began driving when I was rammed into an intersection. My car was spinning, and I quickly gained control only to realize that he was chasing behind me in his own car. We zoomed through the traffic, through red lights, intersections, squeezing through almost impossible car spaces in a movie-like pursuit, and I almost hit 3 pedestrians and God knows how many cars. He chased me down the streets continuously ramming me and then slowing down and speeding up just to ram me again. Glancing back into my rearview mirror, I saw him laughing and taunting me too. And those eyes, I'll never forget them. Immediately when I noticed that it was him chasing me, I called 000, Australia's 911, and tried frantically explaining to the operator where I was and what was happening whilst being rammed and trying to dodge cars and people and sidewalks and poles and street signs. I actually thought I'd try throwing him off and turn into a car park that was right there, but he was too quick and sped in front of my car, locking me in while he blocked the exit with his car. The door opened and he stepped outside, throwing himself at the windows and trying to rip open the doors. I screamed into the phone and begged for help, but they just could not seem to find me. And eventually, I decided that the windows were going to give out soon and I just needed to get out of here. And so I drove up the gutter, ripping off half of the front bonnet of the car and sped all the way back up the street. I thought that I got away when I saw that he was struggling to get back into his car, but that relief shattered when I saw his white car right behind me again, ramming and stopping while just laughing at me. I drove up the 3 suburbs and drove straight to my dad's house after a little while, and I honked the horn like a crazy person, but his car was quick to catch up, and I just couldn't bear the thought of putting anyone in my family at risk of this maniac, so I just kept going, hoping that he wasn't quick enough to swipe my car off the cliff edge that runs along that street. I continued driving, and I even drove over the top of all the roundabouts, but I didn't care at the time. My mother lives around the corner from my dad's, and I started to head there, but as I reached the street, I remembered my 5-year-old sister and my mum, and I just couldn't dare to put them at risk. And so I just kept driving again, around corners, swiping into cars and trying to find every main road possible, begging for help to the operator and for them to just please find me, and continued to fly down the street at 120 Ks. And I mean, I was just an 18-year-old girl, and I've never driven so fast or so chaotically. After about 10 minutes of what seemed like an hour, though, I reached yet another main road and repeated my location to the operator, all the while being rammed and tormented. He sped up in the lane next to me, in the opposite side of the road, and swerved his car in front of mine in an attempt to lock me in so that he could try to rip me out of my car. My immediate reaction was to reverse, so I put the car into R and put the accelerator flat to the floor. It only took seconds for him to get back into his car, however, and he began driving at me, head-on this time, and the only thing that I could do was drive forwards at him. And this is the part where everything just went into slow motion. I saw him coming at me, and we were driving at each other at about 40 Ks, and my only options were to either crash into a parked car next to me, crash head-on into Trent, or crash into a telegraph pole on the other side of the road, and the only thing running through my mind was which way would be the quickest and least painful to die. And so I chose the pole, and I took a hard right turn as I missed the front of it by being saved by the gutter, saving my life by just mere inches. And this made him really mad. He turned the car back around and T-boned the driver's side door, pinning me in, and he got out and yet again punched and kicked and slammed all the windows. Now, let me tell you as well that this guy was at least 100 kilos and 6 foot something, and he was massive, and I just stood no chance. I began to hop from seat to seat, just trying to stay as far away from whichever window broke first as possible. And the whole chase, it lasted about 17 minutes. And this is when the sirens began to ring, and I just broke down and cried as he ran back into his car and took off up the street. He jumped 5 fences before they managed to tackle him, and he spent a weekend in a holding cell and was actually released on bail. My heart ached and my head spun and my mental illness had reached an all-time low, and without him I was honestly just ready to end it. The whole situation just made me want to stop existing. But for some strange reason, I still loved him. It made me sick, but I honestly loved him. He was handed a restraining order, but that didn't stop him, and the day of his release he just began apologizing, begging, crying, saying that he had no memory and he was so sorry and that he'd never do that again. And this is the part that you're all going to hate on me for. But I actually wanted to take him back. I told him that I still loved him and I still spoke to him daily, and he told me that he wouldn't have done those things if I didn't make him so angry, and I apologized sincerely. But the jealousy and protectiveness, it continued. There were more threats like, shouldn't have called the cops and just let me kill you, I'm going to kill everyone close to you, I hope you die tomorrow, and I'll laugh, and honestly, just the list goes on, and it took me about 2 months to wake up and realize what the hell I was doing. And it was after he bashed a boy that I actually kissed and started doing drive-bys at a place that I'd hang out at, just staring at me, that enough was enough. The saddest part, though, is that when I asked him if he had broken off the windows and gotten into the car that day, or somehow had gotten to me, what he would have actually done, he replied with, I honestly don't know. So, If you guys ever feel mistreated, make sure you speak up. If you notice red flags, don't ignore them like I did. Leopard never changes his spots, and if I had stayed with him, I honestly know that I wouldn't be here today to tell you the horror story that was my first relationship. Anyway, thanks for listening, guys, and make sure to stay safe out there.